Steve Harvey had been hosting Family Feud for nearly 2 decades, and he prided himself on being able to read people, to sense when something deeper was happening beneath the surface of the game's show energy and family excitement. But on that crisp November afternoon in 2025, a 95-year-old man named Joseph Castellano would reveal a secret so unexpected, so profoundly moving, and so completely at odds with everyone's assumptions that the entire studio would gasp in unison. Steve would be rendered speechless, and what unfolded would challenge everyone's understanding of identity, family bonds, and the masks people wear for those they love. Two families stood ready to compete, the Johnson family from Michigan and the Castellano family from New York. The Castellano family drew immediate attention because at their center stood Joseph Castellano, a remarkably alert 95-year-old man with thick white hair, bright hazel eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, and an elegant bearing despite his age. He wore a perfectly tailored navy suit with a pocket square, and he moved with the careful precision of someone who refused to let age diminish his dignity. His family surrounded him with obvious love and pride, 4 generations including his son who was in his early 70s, his grandchildren in their 40s and 50s, and his great-grandchildren ranging from teenagers to young adults. During the pre-interview, Joseph had been charming and articulate, telling stories about growing up in Brooklyn in the 1930s, about his late wife Maria, who had passed away 15 years earlier, and about his large Italian-American family that still gathered every Sunday for dinner. The Castellano family won their game with excellent teamwork, and Joseph himself contributed several perfect answers that made Steve joke about him being sharper than contestants a quarter his age. As they lined up for fast money, there was no question that Joseph would be one of the 2 players, despite his family's gentle concerns about whether the excitement might be too much. Joseph's great-grandson Anthony went first and scored 181 points, which meant Joseph needed only 19 points to secure the $20,000. It should have been straightforward, almost guaranteed, but as Joseph approached the podium, Steve noticed something shift in the old man's demeanor. The confident, articulate gentleman who had been entertaining everyone moments before seemed to hesitate, and his hands trembled slightly as they gripped the podium, not just from age, but from some internal struggle. Steve approached him with his characteristic warmth and asked, "Mr. Castellano, you ready to bring this home for your family?" Joseph looked at Steve, then at his family standing behind him with expectant, loving faces, and then something crumbled in his expression. He said in a voice that shook with emotion, "Mr. Harvey, before I answer these questions, before we win this money, I need to tell my family something. I need to tell them something I've hidden from them for 67 years, and I can't stand here and take their love and their pride while still carrying this lie." The studio went quiet with that particular expectant silence that happens when people sense something significant is about to be revealed. Steve's smile faded into an expression of gentle concern, and he said, "Sir, are you sure you want to do this here? Maybe this is something for private." But Joseph shook his head firmly and said, "No, Mr. Harvey, I've had thousands of opportunities to tell them privately over the last 67 years, and I've chickened out every single time. If I don't do it here, now publicly where I can't back out, I'll die with this secret, and I can't do that. They deserve to know the truth about who I really am." Steve looked at the producers uncertainly, then back at Joseph and said, "Okay, sir. Whatever you need to say, we're listening." Joseph took a deep breath, looked at his son Vincent, his grandchildren, his great-grandchildren, all of them watching him with confusion and concern, and he said, "My name is Joseph Castellano, I'm 95 years old, and I am not who you think I am. The man you know as your father, your grandfather, your great-grandfather, that man is real in every way that matters, but the foundation of who I am, the story I've told about where I came from, and how I became Joseph Castellano, that story is a lie." The confusion on his family's faces deepened, but before anyone could speak, Joseph continued, his voice gaining strength as if finally speaking this truth after decades was giving him courage. He said, "I was not born Joseph Castellano in Brooklyn in 1930 to Italian immigrant parents. I was born Yosef Kaplansky in Poland in 1930, and I am a Holocaust survivor. Everything you know about my childhood, about my parents, about my early life, it's all fabricated. I created a new identity when I came to America in 1947, and I've lived as Joseph Castellano for 78 years, never telling anyone, not even your grandmother Maria, the truth about who I really was." The gasps that went through the studio were audible and profound, shock rippling through the audience, the crew, and most intensely through Joseph's family. His son Vincent's face went white, and he said in a voice barely above a whisper, "Dad, what are you saying? This doesn't make sense." But Joseph was shaking his head, tears now streaming down his weathered face, and he said, "It makes perfect sense, Vincent. It's the truth I should have told you 67 years ago when you were born, but I was too afraid, and then the years passed and the lie became too deep, and I didn't know how to tell you without destroying everything." The story Joseph began to tell took everyone back to 1930, to a small town in Poland where Yosef Kaplansky was born to a Jewish family. His father had been a teacher, his mother had run a small shop, and Yosef had been the youngest of 4 children, with 2 older brothers and an older sister. They had been a close-knit, loving family, observant Jews who were deeply rooted in their community and who had lived in that same town for generations. Yosef's early childhood had been happy, filled with Friday night Shabbat dinners, with the sounds of Hebrew prayers, with the warmth of a family and community that valued education and faith and tradition. But in 1939, when Yosef was 9 years old, everything changed when Nazi Germany invaded Poland. Joseph's voice broke as he described what happened next, how the Jewish community in their town was forced into a ghetto, how his father was taken away in 1941 and never seen again, how food became scarce and disease became rampant, and how in 1942, when Yosef was 12 years old, the ghetto was liquidated and everyone was loaded onto trains headed for concentration camps. Joseph paused, his hands gripping the podium so tightly his knuckles were white, and Steve moved closer to him, ready to support him physically if needed. Joseph continued, his voice now barely above a whisper, but still clear enough for everyone to hear. "I was sent to Auschwitz with my mother and sister. My 2 brothers had been taken elsewhere, and I never saw them again. At Auschwitz, my mother and sister were sent immediately to the gas chambers because they were not deemed fit for work. I survived the selection because I lied about my age, said I was 16 instead of 12, and because I was tall for my age and the guards believed me. I was sent to the work camp section, and I spent the next 3 years doing forced labor, watching people die around me every day, surviving on almost no food, and living with the knowledge that my entire family was gone." The studio was completely silent, everyone transfixed by this story of survival and horror. Joseph continued, tears now flowing freely. "In January 1945, when I was 14 years old, the Soviet army was approaching and the Nazis evacuated the camp. We were forced on what they called death marches, walking through snow and freezing temperatures with no food or adequate clothing, and those who fell behind were shot. Somehow I survived, though I don't remember most of the march because I was in a state of near death from starvation and exposure. I was liberated by Soviet soldiers in February 1945, weighing maybe 70 pounds, suffering from typhus and pneumonia, and so traumatized I could barely speak." Joseph looked at his family, seeing the horror and incomprehension on their faces, and he said, "After liberation, I spent 2 years in displaced persons camps, recovering physically but not emotionally. I had no family, no home, no identity beyond being a survivor, and I was surrounded by thousands of other survivors all carrying similar trauma and loss. When the opportunity came to immigrate to America in 1947, I took it, but I made a decision that would define the rest of my life. I decided to erase Yosef Kaplansky, to bury the Jewish boy who had lost everything in the Holocaust, and to become someone new, someone without that history, someone who could start completely fresh. When I arrived in New York, I changed my name from Yosef Kaplansky to Joseph Castellano. I claimed to be the orphaned son of Italian immigrants who had died in an accident, and I created an entire false history for myself that had no connection to Judaism or Poland or the Holocaust. I learned to speak Italian, I memorized details about Italian, American culture, and I essentially became an Italian-American man with no past beyond what I had invented. The shock on his family's faces was profound, but Joseph continued, Needing to explain the full scope of what he had done, in 1950, I met your grandmother Maria at a dance. She was Italian-American, from a big Catholic family in Brooklyn, and she thought I was Italian too, thought I was just like her, and I let her believe that lie. We fell in love, we got married in a Catholic church, and I converted to Catholicism, not because I believed but because it was part of the identity I had constructed. When you were born, Vincent, in 1953, I raised you Catholic, I gave you an Italian name, I celebrated Italian holidays and Christmas and Easter, and I never once told you or your mother or anyone that I was actually Jewish, that I was a Holocaust survivor, that my real name was Joseph Kaplansky, and that I had a family who died in the camps. Your grandmother Maria died in 2010 never knowing the truth about who she had married. You, Vincent, are 67 years old and are just now learning that your father is not who you thought he was. And all of you, my grandchildren and great-grandchildren, you've grown up as Castellanos, as Italian-Americans, as Catholics, never knowing that you're actually descended from a Polish Jewish Holocaust survivor who erased his identity to escape his trauma. Vincent had sat down on the floor of the stage, his head in his hands, visibly struggling to process what he was hearing. His children, Joseph's grandchildren, looked equally stunned, and the great-grandchildren looked confused, not fully understanding the implications of what their great-grandfather was revealing. Steve Harvey stood with tears running down his face, and when Joseph paused, Steve said, "Mr. Castellano, Mr. Kaplansky, why did you hide this? Why did you erase who you were?" Joseph looked at Steve with eyes that held 7 decades of pain and said, "Because I was 17 years old, Mr. Harvey, and I had spent 3 years in hell watching everyone I loved die horrible deaths, and I couldn't carry that identity anymore." Being Yosef Kaplansky meant being someone whose entire family had been murdered, someone who had survived unimaginable horror, someone who was marked by trauma and loss. I wanted to be someone else, anyone else, someone who had a normal past and could have a normal future. I thought if I could just erase Yosef and become Joseph, I could escape the nightmares and the grief and the guilt of surviving when everyone I loved had died. And for a while, it almost worked. I built a new life, I had a family, I was happy in ways I never thought I'd be happy again. But the price of that happiness was living a lie, denying my real family, erasing my heritage, and raising my children and grandchildren in complete ignorance of where they really came from. One of Joseph's granddaughters, a woman in her 40s named Angela, stepped forward and said, "Grandpa, are you saying we're Jewish? That we're not actually Italian?" Joseph nodded and said, "But Jewish law, you would be considered Jewish because I'm Jewish, though you were raised Catholic and that's your culture and identity. But yes, you have Jewish heritage that you never knew about, and you have ancestors who died in the Holocaust whose names you've never heard. My father's name was Abraham Kaplansky. My mother's name was Esther. My brothers were Moshe and David. My sister was Chava. They all died in the camps, and I've never spoken their names aloud to anyone in this family. I erased them along with erasing myself, and that guilt has been eating at me for 78 years. Angela was crying now, and she said, "Why are you telling us this now? Why here?" Joseph looked at her with infinite sadness and said, "Because I'm 95 years old and I'm dying. I have cancer, and the doctors say I have maybe 6 months left, and I realized I can't die as Joseph Castellano without my family ever knowing about Yosef Kaplansky. I can't take this secret to my grave, can't let my real family stay erased, and can't leave my children and grandchildren in ignorance about who they really are. I know this is shocking and painful and confusing, and I know you probably feel betrayed and lied to, and you have every right to feel that way, but I needed you to know the truth before I die." Steve Harvey, who had been standing silently trying to process everything, finally spoke and said, "Sir, I have to ask, did you ever practice Judaism after you came to America? Did you ever observe Jewish holidays or customs privately?" Joseph shook his head and said, "No, Mr. Harvey. When I erased Yosef Kaplansky, I erased all of it. I didn't practice Judaism, didn't observe holidays, didn't speak Yiddish or Hebrew, didn't connect with other Holocaust survivors, did nothing that would tie me to that identity. It was complete erasure, and for a long time I told myself that was what I needed to survive and move forward. But as I've gotten older, I've come to understand that erasing my identity didn't actually heal my trauma, it just buried it deeper, and I've spent 78 years living a half-life, neither fully Joseph Castellano nor Yosef Kaplansky, but some strange hybrid that satisfied no one, least of all myself. He looked at his family again and said, I know this changes everything for all of you. I know you probably have a million questions, and I know some of you might be angry or feel like you don't even know who I am anymore. But I want you to understand that the man you know as your father and grandfather, he's real. My love for you is real. The life we've built together is real. The only thing that was false was my origin story, the details about where I came from. Everything else, everything that matters, that was true. Vincent finally stood up, his face showing a complicated mixture of shock, pain, and something that might have been anger. He looked at his father and said, Dad, I'm 67 years old. I've been your son for 67 years, and I'm just now learning that everything I thought I knew about my heritage was a lie. That I'm not actually Italian, that you're not who you said you were, that I have Jewish ancestry I knew nothing about. Joseph nodded, tears still streaming down his face, and said, Yes, Vincent, and I'm sorrier than you can possibly imagine. I robbed you of your true heritage, denied you the opportunity to know where you really came from, and raised you in a religion that wasn't your ancestral faith. I did all of that because I was traumatized and broken and thought I was protecting myself, but really I was just being a coward who couldn't face his own history. I've had 67 years to tell you the truth, and I waited until I was 95 and dying to finally be honest, and that makes me a coward and a liar, and I don't blame you if you can't forgive me. Steve intervened gently and said, Mr. Castellano, you're being very hard on yourself. You were a child who survived the Holocaust, who lost your entire family, who went through trauma most of us can't even imagine. Creating a new identity might have been the only way you knew how to survive psychologically. That doesn't make you a coward, it makes you a survivor who did what he had to do to keep living. But Joseph shook his head and said, Maybe that's true for the 17-year-old boy who made that choice in 1947, Mr. Harvey. But what about the 30-year-old man who still hadn't told his wife? What about the 50-year-old man who watched his grandchildren grow up without telling them the truth? What about the 80-year-old man who could have spoken up at any time and chose not to? At some point, survival tactics become lies of convenience, and I crossed that line decades ago. I kept the secret not because I needed to for my psychological survival, but because I was afraid of the consequences of telling the truth, afraid of how people would react, afraid of disrupting the comfortable life I had built on a foundation of deception. The producers had stopped the show completely, recognizing that this was no longer a game show situation but something far more profound. Steve made an announcement that the Castellano family would receive the $20,000 regardless of the game outcome, and that the show would provide whatever support and resources the family needed to process this revelation. He also said that they would connect Joseph with Holocaust museums and survivor organizations if he wanted help documenting his story and honoring his lost family. Joseph nodded gratefully and said, Thank you, Mr. Harvey. There's more I need to say, if you'll let me. Steve nodded, and Joseph turned back to his family and said, There's something else you should know. In my bedroom at home, in a box hidden in my closet, there are things I've kept from my old life. There are photographs of my real family, documents with my real name, a prayer book that belonged to my mother, and letters from displaced persons camps. I've had these things for 78 years, and I've looked at them in private when I was alone, but I never showed them to anyone, never spoke about them, never acknowledged them. After I tell you everything here today, I want you to have those things. Want you to see the faces of Abraham and Esther and Moshe and David and Joseph Kaplansky. Want you to know the family that was erased, and want you to decide for yourselves how you want to relate to that history and heritage. Angela, who had seemed most affected by the revelation, asked, Grandpa, what do you want from us? What do you want us to do with this information? Joseph thought for a moment and said, I don't know, Angela. I've spent 78 years running from this identity, and I can't now suddenly dictate how you should relate to it. Maybe some of you will want to learn about Judaism, want to explore that heritage, want to visit Poland, and see where your family came from. Maybe some of you will feel that you're Catholic and Italian, American because that's how you were raised, and that's your cultural identity regardless of DNA or ancestry. Maybe some of you will be angry and want nothing to do with me after learning I lied to you your whole lives. All of those reactions are valid. I just wanted you to know the truth before I die, wanted my real family to be acknowledged and remembered, and wanted you to have the opportunity to decide for yourselves how to relate to this history instead of having that decision made for you by my silence. He paused and then said, "But there is one thing I'd like to ask. When I die, I'd like to be buried under my real name, Yosef Kaplansky, with a Jewish funeral and Jewish burial customs. I've lived as Joseph Castellano for 78 years, but I'd like to die as Yosef Kaplansky, and I'd like to be laid to rest acknowledging who I really was. Your grandmother Maria is buried in a Catholic cemetery, and I understand if you think I should be buried next to her as Joseph Castellano. But if you can find it in your hearts, I'd like to finally stop lying, even in death." Vincent, who had been silent for several minutes, finally spoke and said, "Dad, I don't know how to process any of this. I don't know if I can forgive you for lying to me my entire life, and I don't know who you even are anymore. But I do know that you're my father, and I love you, and if you want to be buried as Yosef Kaplansky with a Jewish funeral, then that's what we'll do. I don't understand why you hid this. I'm angry that you did, and I feel like I don't know my own identity anymore. But you're still my dad, and I'm not going to refuse your dying wish, even if I don't fully understand it." Joseph broke down completely at that, sobbing in a way that shook his entire frail body, and Vincent came forward and embraced his father while they both cried. The rest of the family gradually joined them, creating a group embrace on the Family Feud stage, while the audience and crew watched in tears, and Steve Harvey stood to the side with his hand over his heart, visibly moved by this scene of family love persisting even through shocking revelation and profound pain. When Joseph finally composed himself enough to speak, he said to the camera, "I want to say something to any other Holocaust survivors who might be watching this, or to children of survivors, or to anyone who has hidden their identity or their history because of trauma. I understand why you did it. I understand the need to escape, to become someone else, to leave the pain behind. But I want you to know that hiding doesn't actually heal you. It just delays the healing and creates new pain. I thought I was protecting myself and my family by erasing Yosef Kaplansky, but what I actually did was deny myself the opportunity to truly heal from my trauma, and I denied my family the opportunity to know and honor the people who died and the heritage they came from. If you're carrying a secret like mine, if you've hidden who you are or where you came from, I'm asking you to be braver than I was. Tell your truth sooner. Let your family know the whole story. Don't wait until you're 95 and dying to finally be honest, because the cost of that delay is enormous, not just for you but for everyone you love." The episode that eventually aired was a special 2-hour documentary that included Joseph's revelation, extensive historical context about Holocaust survivors and identity change, interviews with experts about survivor trauma and the psychology of identity erasure, and follow-up footage with the Castellano family as they processed Joseph's revelation and began exploring their newly discovered heritage. The special also included footage from the box in Joseph's closet, showing for the first time in 78 years the photographs of the Kaplansky family who had died in the Holocaust. The images of Joseph's parents, brothers, and sister, all of whom had died in the camps, were heartbreaking, and seeing the young Yosef Kaplansky in photos next to the 95-year-old Joseph Castellano was a stark illustration of the double life he had lived for nearly 8 decades. The response to the special was enormous and deeply divided. Many viewers praised Joseph for finally telling the truth and saw his confession as an act of courage, even if it came very late. They were moved by his obvious pain and guilt, and they appreciated that he was using his platform to encourage other survivors or hidden people to speak their truths sooner. Others were more critical, arguing that Joseph had robbed his family of their heritage, that he had denied his children and grandchildren their Jewish identity, and that his late Life confession was self-serving and didn't undo the decades of deception. Holocaust educators and survivors had complicated reactions, with some understanding Joseph's choice to hide his identity as a trauma response, while others felt that erasing Holocaust history, even personal history, was problematic and dishonored those who died. The Jewish community's response was particularly complex. Some were sympathetic to Joseph's trauma and welcomed him and his family back into Jewish identity, offering support and resources for reconnection. Others felt that Joseph had committed a kind of betrayal by hiding his Judaism and raising Catholic children when he was actually Jewish, seeing this as a continuation of the erasure that Hitler had tried to accomplish. There were debates about whether Joseph's grandchildren and great-grandchildren, who had been raised Catholic and knew nothing of Judaism, could or should be considered Jewish, and about what it meant to reclaim a heritage that had been deliberately hidden for generations. Rabbi organizations reached out to offer support. Holocaust museums offered to help document Joseph's story and preserve his family's memory, and genealogy organizations offered assistance in researching the Kaplansky family history and trying to find any other relatives who might have survived. Joseph's family went through their own complex journey of processing the revelation. Vincent struggled significantly, feeling that his entire identity had been based on a lie and not knowing how to reconcile the Italian, Catholic upbringing he had known with the Jewish heritage he had just discovered. He went through anger, grief, and eventually a kind of acceptance, though he said in interviews that he would probably be processing this revelation for the rest of his life. He began learning about Judaism and about the Holocaust, trying to understand his father's trauma and the context in which the identity change had happened. He also wrestled with his own identity, ultimately deciding that he was culturally Italian, American and Catholic because that's how he was raised, but that he also acknowledged and honored his Jewish ancestry and the family members who died in the Holocaust. Joseph's grandchildren reacted in different ways, with some embracing their newly discovered Jewish heritage enthusiastically, taking Hebrew classes, celebrating Jewish holidays, and even considering converting to Judaism formally, while others felt that their Catholic upbringing was their true identity and that DNA didn't change who they fundamentally were. Angela, who had been one of the first to speak during the revelation, became particularly interested in Holocaust education and began volunteering with museums and survivor organizations, feeling that her family's story needed to be shared and that the Kaplansky family needed to be remembered and honored. She also traveled to Poland with Joseph's box of documents and photographs, visiting the town where the Kaplanskys had lived and the camp where they had died, documenting everything and creating a memorial website dedicated to Abraham, Esther, Moshe David and Chava Kaplansky. Joseph lived for 8 months after his revelation, dying in July 2026 just after his 96th birthday. In those final months, he gave extensive interviews about his life as both Yosef Kaplansky and Joseph Castellano, about his Holocaust experiences, about his decision to change his identity, and about the cost of hiding his truth for so long. He worked with the USC Show Foundation to record his testimony, ensuring that his story would be preserved for future generations. He also met with other Holocaust survivors and with children of survivors, and these conversations seemed to bring him some measure of peace, as he realized he was not alone in having struggled with identity and trauma, though his particular path of complete identity erasure was relatively rare among survivors. Joseph's funeral was held according to Jewish custom, with his body buried under the name Yosef Kaplansky, his Hebrew name Yosef ben Avraham used in prayers, and a rabbi officiating. The funeral was attended by both his Italian, American Catholic friends and family, and by members of the Jewish community who welcomed him back in death, even though he had hidden during life. Vincent gave a eulogy that captured the complexity of his feelings, saying, "My father was two people, or maybe he was one person who lived two lives. He was Joseph Castellano, the man who raised me, who taught me right from wrong, who loved his family fiercely, and who built a good life despite unimaginable trauma. And he was Yosef Kaplansky, the boy who survived hell, who lost everything, and who carried pain that I'm only beginning to understand. I'm angry that he lied to me, I'm sad that he felt he had to, and I'm grateful that he finally told the truth before it was too late. I don't know if I forgive him, but I love him, and I honor both the man he was and the boy he tried to forget. The Kaplansky family was memorialized at several Holocaust museums, with Joseph's photographs and documents displayed as part of exhibits about survivors and about the long-term impact of Holocaust trauma. The museums created educational materials using Joseph's story to discuss the complicated ways survivors coped with their experiences, the question of identity erasure and cultural loss, and the importance of acknowledging Holocaust victims and ensuring their stories were not lost. Joseph's testimony was used in educational settings to help students understand that the Holocaust's impact didn't end in 1945, that survivors carried trauma for their entire lives, and that the choices survivors made about how to live with that trauma were complicated and sometimes involved difficult trade-offs. Steve Harvey spoke about Joseph's revelation frequently in the years that followed, calling it one of the most profound moments in his career. He talked about the weight of standing there while a 95-year-old man finally acknowledged his true identity after 7 decades of hiding, about the shock of learning that someone's entire identity was based on escaping trauma, and about the complicated questions it raised about what we owe to our heritage, to our families, and to truth. He said that Joseph's story had changed how he thought about identity, trauma, and the masks people wear, and that it had reminded him that everyone carries hidden stories, and that television sometimes accidentally becomes a vehicle for those stories to finally be told. The broader conversations sparked by Joseph's revelation were extensive and ongoing. Holocaust educators used his story to discuss the long-term psychological impacts of genocide and trauma. Identity scholars discussed what it means to choose an identity versus inherit one, and whether someone like Joseph, who was born Jewish but lived as Catholic, should be considered Jewish, Catholic, both, or something else entirely. Genetic genealogists discussed how DNA testing was revealing hidden heritage in many families, and how people were navigating the discovery of ancestral identities they knew nothing about. And ethicists debated whether Joseph had been right to hide his identity, whether his trauma justified the deception, whether there was a point at which the deception became indefensible, and what the implications were for his descendants, who now had to figure out how to relate to a heritage they had just discovered. For the Castellano, Kaplansky family, as they began calling themselves, the journey was ongoing. They established a foundation in memory of the murdered Kaplansky family members, dedicated to Holocaust education and to supporting survivors and descendants dealing with intergenerational trauma. They created an annual memorial event on the anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz, where they gathered to remember Abraham, Esther, Moshe, David, and Chava Kaplansky, and to acknowledge Yosef Kaplansky, who survived but carried the weight of that survival for the rest of his life. They maintained their Italian, American cultural practices while also learning about and incorporating Jewish traditions, creating a unique hybrid family culture that honored both the life Joseph Castellano had built and the heritage Joseph Kaplansky had tried to leave behind. In the end, Joseph's story became a testament to the enduring impact of trauma, the complicated nature of identity, the courage required to finally speak truth even very late in life, and the resilience of family love even through shocking revelation. It showed how the Holocaust's impact extended far beyond the 6 million who died, affecting survivors and their descendants in ways that continued for generations. It illustrated how trauma can lead people to make choices that seem necessary for survival, but that carry their own costs and consequences. And it demonstrated that truth, even when it comes 78 years late, has value in allowing families to fully know each other, in honoring those who died, and in giving descendants the opportunity to understand and claim their complete heritage. Joseph's final words, recorded just days before his death, were, "I spent 78 years being Joseph Castellano, and I don't regret the life I built under that name. I loved my wife, I raised my children, I was happy in ways I never thought I'd be happy after the camps. But I should have found a way to be both Joseph and Yosef, to honor my past while building my future, to acknowledge the Kaplanskys while raising the Castellanos. By completely erasing one to become the other, I denied myself wholeness, and I denied my family their full heritage." If I could do it over, I would tell the truth much sooner, would raise my children knowing both sides of their identity, and would make sure that Abraham, Esther, Moshe, David, and Chava were remembered rather than erased. But I can't do it over, so all I can do is tell the truth now, apologize for the decades of deception, and hope that my family can forgive me and can honor both the man I became and the boy I tried to forget. I am both Yosef Kaplansky and Joseph Castellano, and I die hoping that acknowledging that truth, however late, has some value and meaning.